Okay, so my name is Derek Beach, and again, welcome to this short course taster. I'm a professor of political science at Aarhus University and have been working on developing process tracing methods for now quite a few years. Originally, I started working on this because I was not happy with the existing case study methods. I thought that they were trying to trying to replicate the idea of doing statistics with just small n, and did not find that that was really actually what we should be doing. So that kind of what started me down this pathway, and I'm really looking forward to hopefully meeting some of you this summer and working on your process tracing designs. I find this type of teaching is really rewarding, and it's really fascinating to see all the different types of research projects that people are using case study methods to work with. Hilde.
Yeah, thanks. So my name is Hilde van Meegdenburg. I'm at Leiden University, and my own work is generally so I apply process tracing to foreign policy analysis. And I think, Derek, there's actually something we also coincidentally have quite a bit of overlap, even though you look at European policy making, European Union, I look at foreign policy making of states. I've been somehow involved with methods, and I remember this very well. At the end of my first year of my PhD, it was 2012. I went to a summer school, a summer school on methods. And at the end of that summer school, it was actually taking Ingo Roving's course on case studies. And at the end of that course, he asked me whether I, for next year, would want to be his TA, so his teaching assistant at one of these summer schools. And I said yes. And I've essentially just never left. And for me, I remember that course, so many things just fell into place, which shows how incredibly important method is and can be to understanding your own research projects and to what it is that you're doing. And then at some point, I was in Berlin doing my PhD, and Derek actually came by to give a 2-day process tracing workshop at our graduate school. And I think that's where we really met. And then I've been initially TAing, so teaching assistant of Derek during the various summer schools and winter schools, and actually now teaching the first week for a fair amount of years already. I think in 2016 it was the first time. And one of the things that I so much appreciate out of these courses, especially now that I'm working myself on methods as well, is seeing where things work and where things can go wrong. So in conversation with participants in these types of courses, you can really feel what is unclear about the method, what needs to be further developed. And so it's a real drive also for me, kind of just in my own work, to keep engaging with the method, also with this very practical side beyond my own research. And so me too, I'm very much looking forward again to Vienna, to kind of see all the troubles that people and all the problems that people run into, and then also for myself to kind of afterwards try and find theoretical methodological solutions to those problems. It's one of the things I appreciate.
Cool. So here are the two courses that we're offering, and just maybe just two words about the format. Um, the the a normal course is a half a day, which means that you will then have time either in the morning or the afternoon. Actually, I don't remember if your course is morning or afternoon, but to do work, you'll often be given exercises, et cetera, applying some of the methodological lessons on your own work. And that would be a typical course. So it's about 15 teaching hours a week. In the course that I'm teaching is a 25-hour format. It's also a smaller group where we will be kind of more workshopping. So we're kind of assuming you know the fundamentals, and it's going to be workshopping your own projects. But maybe Hilda, if you wanted to say a few words about kind of what you're going to be doing in your first week.
So I think the main and very important thing that is done in the first week is really lay kind of the theoretical and methodological basis of what is process tracing, how does it differ from, but also can complement other case-based methods, cross-case explorations. Is there such a thing as comparative process tracing? How is it possible? So the idea there is really to kind of think through what method can mean for your case, and we will be working with applications. So there will be small assignment that asks you, okay, what we've discussed today. Let's say we just discussed causal productivity. I'll be talking about that in a little bit as well. I'm going to ask you, okay, so now try and apply that to your own case. But still, you'll see, especially if this is the first time you're confronted with it, you're grappling with these questions, it remains a little bit more abstract, where I think what is the difference with the second week course is where you're really going to work with it in a much more practical sense. I guess, Derek, but correct me if I'm wrong. It would also be useful in your course to have a little bit of empirical data to work with. Is that correct?
Yeah, yeah. So for the second week course, it's basically you are at varying degrees. I mean, you might have a full kind of almost finished design, or you are relatively early, but at least you're able to have what the kind of the three core things that you should have in week two, which are also the say the three core elements that we're also going to be talking about today, are that you have some theoretical expectations or like a process theory of how we get from some cause to an outcome, and that will be actually in kind of you'll be presenting and we'll be discussing it in class, your own work. And then also thinking about empirics. What kind of, okay, if this process worked as you theorized, what are the kind of empirical traces and how could you study that empirically? And then the third element is basically about case selection and what kind of case you've or cases you've selected. What is your overall design? I mean, are you doing a lot of comparisons also, or is it just a kind of a single, like, let's say a particularly historically important case, the Brazilian democratization process, where it's not a case of something, it's just the Brazilian democratization process. So you need to come to the course with a relatively clear, at least clear ideas of the three components, because the whole idea of these kind of workshops like this um, is that I'm looking at it, but also the other smart brains in the room are looking at your project and giving you really intense feedback from people that actually know and are using the method. So this is kind of ideally it's a tool to really improve your process tracing design. And I know that from this kind of format, there's been multiple articles, for example, that have come out of this, where PhD students who've kind of gone through this have then they ended up uh, getting the final result published. So
And then
so it's
the week one course should get you to actually have that design and setup that you could then actually refine and work with in the week two course.
yeah. Yeah. Do you have anything else you want to say about week one or?
No, not necessarily. I think no, I think the most important thing to know is that it really gets you at understanding the methods and thinking through what could be design and the design and the setup of your own work. That should be the outcome of week one. If we get to that, then we've done a really good job.
Yeah, great. So this short uh, course taster is going to have just a couple elements where we're going to kind of walk through. For those of you that are not familiar with process tracing, we're just introduce it as a case-based method and what that actually means. Hilde is then gonna, and this is probably the longest of these components, talk a little bit about what we're actually tracing, and there is considerable disagreement, or I'd say there's different schools, and there are different schools on this, and there's not a right or wrong answer. It really depends more on kind of your understanding of causation, which is ontology. So in that respect, there's not a right or wrong answer. Of course, your ontology then should lead you to an epistemology and a methodology that is in alignment. So there can be a right or wrong. I mean, if you believe uh, causation is counterfactuals, then you need to do some form of empirical analysis that enables you to investigate difference making. But beyond that, yeah, I would say this is also one of the strengths of the method as it's developing is that we're actually able to span across different research traditions, and maybe there is also a more interpretivist variant of process tracing. I'll talk briefly about what we're tracing and real briefly about case selection, because that's both a huge issue, huge discussion, but it's also very quickly summarized. So if I was just going to briefly say, process tracing is basically a kind of a tool to go beyond correlations. So, for example, your typical comparative analysis, like if you're doing a qualitative comparative analysis, where you're comparing kind of X and Y across many cases, unless you have some form of, I would say, yeah, something that enables you to actually say that it's, for example, a natural experiment, or it's an actual experiment, like a randomized controlled trial. You just have a correlation. We can see that cases that have X also have Y, but is that causal? And the idea of process tracing is basically to explore linkages. So in this respect, process tracing is also a within case method, in the form of it takes an instance of a theory playing out, and tries to, yeah, basically open up what you could call the black box of causation. So if we have, for example, just here we can see, for example, intelligence capacity and levels of violence, and it looks like there's a relationship between X1. When X1 is low, there's a high degree of violence, and vice versa. When X1 is high, you have a low degree of violence. But is that causal? I mean, sorry, and that would be the process tracing, for example, selecting one of these cases and going in and seeing how intelligence capacity actually plays through kind of a process, people doing things, interacting with each other, that potentially at least produces or contributes to produce a given outcome. And so process tracing in this respect is asking more kind of, it's not an under what conditions kind of type of research question per se. It's more about the kind of the how and why kind of questions, like how can low intelligence capacity of security forces actually produce more violence, for example. The reason why we would call it a case-based method is because I would say it's kind of bottom up. You're selecting particular cases, you're getting to know them, and you're trying to go in depth within the case to try and probe that process. And again, a case is one instance of some theoretical, like a cause, process, outcome taking place. The three core elements of kind of that are shared around along process tracing, or here, let's say the actual word process, is the following. So the process in process tracing is some kind of theory that you explain, either very simply, it can be quite abstract, almost just like a headline, or it might be a very detailed, with all sorts of moving parts and interactions going on. But you have some theory of a causal process linking a cause and outcome together in some form of causal relationship. And Hilde will come into that in a second. So then your causal process is some kind of interactions between social actors, that are linking X and Y together in some kind of causal relationship. The tracing element of process tracing is that we're trying to see, for example, the some form of empirical traces, and there's disagreements about what these are and how we should analyze them. We'll come into them both in week 1 and week 2 in much greater detail. But often, you'll have different forms of empirical observables. So the idea in particular, at least the type of process tracing that I use, it's often the tracing involves people doing things that then leave empirical traces. If I put forward a proposal, I have an actual proposal, a physical trace of that activity that I've done. Okay. Yeah. I think but yeah. Let me let Hilde share her slides on the next part. So let's dig into the actual what is a process, which is a huge question, and this is not a philosophy of science course, so you could spend a lot of time talking about this, but I'll give the floor to Hilde now.
To be fair, it's also, I always end up in the first week course to talk quite a lot about this, and also always notice that people find it incredibly interesting to have that conversation. So what is a process? I know, Derek, you've recently moved away a little bit more from using the term mechanism. I'll use it here nonetheless because it's still also in one of the slides, and it's a conversation to be had, whether it's a mechanism or whether it's a process and what labels we can put on it. But for now, we're going to have a slightly different look at the two questions: what are we tracing and how? And Derek will go into the practical question of how, but how also has a theoretical component to it. And the theoretical component of the how question in this case is the epistemology. So I'm just going to take you very quickly through ontology and epistemology, because what are we tracing is an ontological question, right? What are these processes? What is a mechanism? And how can we trace that as an epistemological question? To the extent that ontology is your theory of being. So in this case, what is a mechanism would be your central question. Epistemology is your theory of knowing. So if this is our understanding of mechanisms, or if this is our understanding of processes, then how can we study that? How can we obtain knowledge about these things that we're interested in? And I'm going to give you a little bit of an adaptation of an image that is taken from one of Derek's pieces it's the Oxford Encyclopedia of Political Research. So it's a little bit, I adapted it slightly so I can actually give it by bits. So there's different understandings of what mechanisms are. And part of the interesting thing right now about process tracing is that it's still so much under development. So we're still actually debating what things are, what processes are, how we should study them. And one of the perspectives that is out there, if you wish, is the idea that mechanisms are change of counterfactual claims. And if you have that, the kind of your understanding of causation that underlays it is obviously a counterfactual understanding. But what that means is that what you as a researcher, if you have a counterfactual logic of causation, what you want to see is continuously once, if X, then Y. So if a certain thing happens, then a certain outcome also happens. And once, if not X, then also not Y. So someone who would set up a mechanism or a process as a chain of counterfactuals wants you to show for every step along the way that if that step would occur, if that step does occur, then we go to the next step. But also if that step does not occur, then the mechanism would break down and we would not actually go to that next step. And so every step in a mechanism would be set up in this type of counterfactual logic. This complicates, I would say, to a certain extent, process tracing, because the actual kind of, if you want to do actual case studies, you'd have to have enough cases that vary on all these specific points. And so it gets difficult. And then you need to do the actual counterfactual to the extent you need to get into a thought experiment. But it's very well possible, I'd say, prominent people that are thinking of mechanisms as counterfactual claims right now, as change of counterfactual claims, are James Mahoney, Carsten Snyder in his most understanding, there is a piece by Ingo Rolfing and Carsten Snyder that also very clearly sets up counterfactual logic as the logic underlying process tracing. But that's just one way of understanding it. But as Derek said, ultimately, if you do your own research, you can make any choice as long as you follow it through consistently and coherently. So you have to think through, okay, if I see this, if I understand this as a chain of counterfactual claims, then you have to logically do research that adds up to that. And you're going to have to epistemology. You're going to have to show at kind of controlled comparisons that this variation actually holds for these different steps. Another way to think of processes or mechanisms is as productive linkages in actual cases. So here, processes, and this is something I'm going to work out in a second still a little bit, the idea of causal productivity becomes important. So the idea is here that we have a mechanism where there is a causal productivity that moves from a certain set of starting conditions and a trigger through a chain of activities to a particular outcome. But these activities are not just understood as counterfactuals, but they're understood as causally productive for the next, with the idea being, or the hope being, if you wish, that research is actually able to lay bare this causal productivity. I'm going to get to that in a second, what we mean with it. And so you get a different logic of doing process tracing, where you really look at what actually happened in a case. With the first understanding, you wouldn't really do a single case study, wouldn't technically be possible. You always need that counterfactual case. So you're always somehow doing two cases at the very least. In the second understanding, a single case should be possible. We should be able to make a causal inference, make causal claims on the basis of having studied a single case. Now, a third way of understanding mechanisms, I'm going to get into this a little bit as well in a second, is a much more interpretivist understanding of doing research. If you're more of a social constructivist ontologically, and you'd say, okay, well, processes are very frequently social processes, narrative processes that construct meanings of things, then epistemologically, what you want to study, right? If you want to prove that the world is socially constructed or certain things hinge on social constructions, you're going to have to prove the mechanisms or the processes that underlay these social constructions. So you're going to do a much more interpretivist type of analysis, looking at practices and discourses and studying how those meanings came about and how those meanings subsequently were causally productive for an outcome. Now, I would dare to say, though, I'm going to see how Derek reacts now. I would say that the week 1 and week 2 courses focus primarily on these latter two understandings of processes and mechanisms. So this is not to say that you can't understand them as counterfactuals. It's just to say that the process, the 2 weeks, the workshops that we're offering, the courses that we're offering, focus on these latter two understandings. Probably even the second a little bit more dominantly than the third, but the third figures in there because what they would have in common for me, and that's important, is this shared focus on causal productivity as the underlying importance of studying mechanisms. So just very briefly, what do I mean when we say causal productivity? And I'm just going to give you a very straightforward, simple example that I think should be understandable for everybody. And that starts with a tree. We can start trees and we can study how trees, if we give them water, we can have a setup, we can have a comparative setup, 2 laboratories. We have 500 trees in one laboratory. We have 500 trees in the other. And then we can do a comparison, right? 500 trees, we give them water regularly and we see that they grow and flourish. 500 trees, we don't give them water. We see that they will perish, right? These trees will die. Okay, so now we've established that there's a correlation between giving water and healthy trees. But the question that would never be answered by this type of research setup is very simply how? How does water make trees flourish? To do that, we need a different type of logic. We need to study something else. We need to study the process. And the argument here is we could study that in a single tree. And the idea then is to focus on lays it. Now, this idea is actually taken from a by now somewhat old paper, actually, written by Mahama and colleagues, where the idea is to focus on entities engaging in activities and how those entities and activities hand on the causal energy, the causal powers to a next entity and a next activity that then start doing something wherewith you kind of get a logical explanation from a starting point to an end point. So entities in this case are the things, the people in our case very frequently, could also be groups or communities that engage in activities, and they do so by certain of their properties, right? So we'd expect those entities to have certain properties that allow them to engage in certain activities. Activities then, quite simply, are the producers of change. Applying this to our tree. Now, I'm putting up here, and I'm drawing your attention briefly to it, there's a bunch of scope conditions, and I'm going to get back to that because I think ultimately the scope conditions make the difference between the two, the latter two understandings of mechanisms, and the difference between a more focus just on the causal continuity, but focused on possible bounded generalizations versus a much more interpretivist understanding. But let's work with the scope conditions for a second, right? So we're in my laboratory. We know that there's sufficient CO2, there's nutritious soil, and there's sunlight. Now, the triggering factor here is that we give the tree water. We assume that, something happens and that triggering that moment, actually entities start engaging in activities. The first step then would be an entity engaging in an activity, logically triggered by the trigger. Now, in most of our research projects will have human entities, but in this case, it's a tree. So I think a logical first entity in this mechanism could be the roots, right? The roots feel that there's water and they start doing their root thing. In this case, I just made it. They start absorbing the water. So this is a very concrete instance where you can say, okay, we have a trigger and an entity, roots, start doing something. They start absorbing that water from the soil, which is the nutritious soil, which is something we just take as a background condition for now. Now that the water is in the tree, because the roots just absorbed it, a next step happens, right? And in this case, we'll just have to imagine that a tree, somehow like a human, has a metabolic system that starts extracting the minerals from the water. And we can see how within the scope condition, the second step kind of logically follows from the first, and then we kind of can continue on. Now, this is where my knowledge of trees ended, so I'll just keep it at an entity engaging in an activity, and the outcome that we're having is a healthy tree. The idea here is that it's entities engaging in activities that hand on the causal productivity to the next step that allows us to logically follow what happened in the case by studying the actual case itself. Derek will get into that when you say, okay, so how do we do this, right? And what are empirical manifestations of processes? But this is a way to conceptualize such a process, kind of a thick understanding of processes and mechanisms that we'll be working with in these courses. I called it a water processing mechanism, but that's beside the point. Now, just to draw your attention to this for a second, this idea of scope conditions. Scope conditions are quite inherently related to generalizations. Now, process tracing can be a regular occurrence. So we can have the idea that a particular process or a particular mechanism would play out regularly given certain conditions. These are my 500 trees that under these conditions will all flourish and grow if I give them water. And they will boost the same mechanism. We could study them all, we'd see the same mechanism working out in each of these cases. Now, in the social sciences, generally, our cases are pretty strongly bounded by these scope conditions. That means we make small generalizations to a few, maybe a handful of other cases that we deem sufficiently similar to the case that we just studied. If you're interested in more interpretivist process tracing, then probably even these types of bounded generalizations they're not necessarily what you're after, but that's just to say, so if you look at Mahamardal, they also have this. So many conceptualizations of mechanisms and processes are at this level of regularity. I think, Derek, you're also working on a paper on middle range or mid-range theory and middle range theorizing that has a regularity component in there, right? We'd expect that certain mechanisms, given certain conditions, could function multiple times. But, and that's interesting because this is now where do we draw causal inference? They also say, well, it's not the regularities explained, but it's the activities that sustain the regularities that really gives us traction on mechanisms rather than just the comparisons. One thing, and then I'll leave it at that and give the floor back to Derek. So at least from the way I'm treating it, the way I'm understanding it, scope conditions are inherently related to generalizations. But scope conditions also allow for very bounded generalizations. So rather than having any kind of sweeping theories that explain the entire world, mechanistic theories tend to be bounded and set in a particular time and space, a particular context. Context matters. Context is what allows entities to engage in the activities that they need to engage in to bring about that outcome. However, if you're an interpretivist, right, if you consider yourself a constructivist or an interpretivist, then even such bounded generalizations may be not what you're looking for. And so what you then might say, so we actually want a much more thick understanding of context still. Context in this type of conceptualization could make cases entirely idiosyncratic and uncomparable. Now, there are this understanding, and this is even, I would say, even more under development than process tracing in general, is this idea of what could then be interpretivist process tracing. So if you're interested in, also definitely come to the CEU and have that conversation with us, because we're actually both working on it at the same time. And so what I want to give you for this is that it is possible, it should be possible to have, if there's one method that can do idiosyncratic case studies and still kind of look at a particular type of causality that is behind it, even if it's a social causality, even if it's a very contextually embedded causality, it's process tracing. So it should be possible. But we should still have those conversations. If you're interested in either of this, you're coming to the courses. I'd say if you're interested on the understanding on scope conditions, bounded generalizations, your go-to source here is Beach and Pedersen. So you're right in the right place. They still have the only book length treatment of this, and then of course the whole host of papers that come with it. I'm personally working on a book right now with Patrick Mello. We're calling it Uncovering Causal Symptoms, where I really want to think through process tracing in a comparative perspective, potentially also in combination with QCA. But that's in progress, so you still have to wait for that. When it comes to kind of a interpretivist PT and looking at really thick context, I think the first person to use it that explicitly was Ludwig Norman. He has a paper. It's fairly short, actually, on interpretivist process tracing. I 1 year ago, 2 years ago, it's 2025 by now, also have a book chapter on interpretivist process tracing. They'll call it an analyticist approach, because I think that approach still, it can be interpretivist, but it doesn't have to be. And Derek also, together with two colleagues, has last year published a paper that's going in that direction. So there's definitely movements, and we're thinking about it, but this is still very much under construction. But like I said, I'm very happy to have the conversation with each form of process tracing, or each understanding, also that we can kind of work out what are the differences, what are the similarities, and what we do with these different understandings of process tracing.
Cool.
Of sharing. That's the
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, Hilda's talked then about these.
that was it.
So the different understandings, and I'll talk just a couple, just maybe a little bit more of an exemplification, but at least a little bit more on kind of what are the types of empirics, what are the types of analyses. I think one of the things when we're thinking about actual, like, how do we trace it? In this respect, process tracing is actually more of a research design than an actual method. So there's nothing inherent in process tracing that doesn't mean that you can use large end statistical methods, for analyzing, for example, networks. You could use different forms of discourse, or sorry, network analysis. It could be discourse network analysis or social network analysis, etc. I mean, in theory, if you could do experiments, but experiments in understood in a more, I would say, mechanistic way, where we're not so much interested in the actual difference, but we're actually interested in observing what's going on when we have done the treatment, what's happening in the positive cases. Um, so in this respect, process tracing is kind of, I would say, methods agnostic. It really depends on your theory, kind of at the level. I mean, are you of analysis? Are you looking at let's say some kind of process theory about large demographic changes or something? And then, of course, yeah, statistics are going to be very relevant tools to gain, I would say, empirical fingerprints of processes playing out. So this respect, process tracing is actually more of a research design than a method per se. Um, so the one way of the counterfactual is basically saying, well, a mechanism or parts of mechanisms make a difference, and then to investigate the difference, just like we do in an experiment, we have to investigate difference making, which means that we have to, the positive and then the absence. In this respect, this is, the potential outcome framework. So you could do some kind of controlled comparison. It could be some kind of most similar systems design, or it could be these kind of more hypothetical thought experiments. So we have a colleague and a friend, Rosa Runhard, who's done quite a lot about thinking about counterfactual process tracing, what this can look like. And just as an example here, she has an article, this is now a while ago, but where she's kind of putting forward, well, like, let's say that we want to investigate some kind of process about how transnational insurgents teach local insurgents how to use a particular tactic here, suicide bombing. That we would then want to kind of look at the difference between another case maybe where we have these transnational insurgents, but we don't have the teaching process taking place. And if we can then ascertain, well, in the one case we actually, we see this process and we do get this increased use. In the other case, no process is actually triggered and we don't have the outcome. And if everything else is equal, then you could make the inference, this is basically a natural experiment. You can make the inference that that mechanism produced the difference in the outcome. The challenge, of course, is that here it really requires two cases are most similar on all irrelevant conditions, which can be actually, I'm going to jump over modularity, but the idea would be basically that you also need to be, a process is not just like a holistic whole. You could actually just like go in and modulate each part of a process if it's a multi-part process. The core challenge is basically to find similarity, or to then you end up, if you can't, then you end up with more hypothetical thought experiments, which in that respect you don't actually have any real evidence. You have logic, which can be sometimes compelling. We will explore this, and of course, if you have this understanding, there's, in particular, Rosa has, I think, really pushed us to think a lot, and she's developed some better frameworks recently, that we will, if people are coming with counterfactual ideas and projects, that we will explore during the course. But let me let me move over to the maybe the more typical, especially in Europe, would be the kind of the tracing process in a more, I wouldn't necessarily say positivistic, but in a or neo-positivistic, but in a kind of really just focusing on the observables, and then the more social process tracing, the more interpretive. So just briefly, um, so the idea in the productive account of processes or mechanisms is that we're working with what could be called mechanistic evidence, which is something different than difference making evidence. What we get out of an experiment. Mechanistic evidence are basically the observables left by parts of a process, or in particular, the activities. Um, this is a figure that I've developed, and the idea is basically how do we get from our theory, actor engaging in some activity, and evaluate what actual sources tell us, or what is it evidence of, um, and then how do we go, for example, from okay, well, if this actor is engaging in an activity, we would expect to find this kind of fingerprint. If we find it, there really are not a lot of alternate explanations. So that, for example, in theory, that would be very strong evidence. But of course, you might have, like, if you can't trust the actual source, then it's not very strong evidence. An example of this could be, well, if a suspect committed the crime, in theory, you would expect, that activity committing the crime to one observable could be that the suspect confesses. And you could argue, well, why would somebody confess to a crime unless they actually committed it? But if, of course, then we go down the actual observational level and our actual source of that confession, let's say that we elicited the confession through torture. Of course, we cannot then trust that source. So in theory, you might have had a very strong piece of evidence that would confirm the suspect's guilt. But if we can't trust the actual source, then it's not very strong evidence. So we'll spend a lot of time, both in week one and week two, talking about how do we evaluate the probative value or the evidential value of evidence. How do we work with different sources? How do we establish that we can trust sources? So in this respect, I think process tracing draws a lot on, at the more observational level, we draw a lot on history and historical methods about source criticism, where they're particularly strong. And then the actor engaging in activities, and then the observable manifestations. This is in particular, Bayesian reasoning is typically used to think through alternative explanations for finding evidence. Let me just show you an example real briefly. This is from an article where I have an activity where experts are basically teaching policymakers. What you would then do is you'd say, well, in theory, for part two, we should expect to find, and here we put forward empirically what we would expect to find, kind of in abstract terms. A rhetorical structure of these analogical justifications. So this is a proposition or about observable or potential mechanistic evidence that we might expect to find. And in the article, we discuss, well, if we find this, are there alternative explanations for finding? And then we actually would say, then you that's your potential evidence. And then you have to actually go out and look at sources. And then you would have an actual observation where you would then spend some time talking about, well, is this actually what I expected to find, based on my theory? Can I trust this source? What was the context within which this source gave this statement, et cetera? So process tracing spends a lot of time thinking about how we get from empirics to theory and back again. In social process tracing, what we're trying to do there is kind of taking this a step further in some respects, because the interpretivist would, for example, if we're talking about action, would say that we also have to understand the meanings behind actions. So it's not just that an activity took place, but for an activity to trigger, to actually understand why actor B responded in a particular way, we would want to look at things like how did actor B perceive the action from actor A? And then actor A, what kind of intention, for example, what were the motives? Uh, what was the meaning that they ascribed the action that they undertook? Those would be some of the kind of the additional questions that the social process tracer. Um, so you would include both, maybe say more positivist evidence, like, okay, we can see this activity took place, but to really understand the meaning of the action and why actors were responding in the way that they were doing, we would also want to try and dig into evidence of motives, understandings, perceptions, practices, what is typical action in this kind of setting, et cetera. And that's where you would, for example, if we just have a real simple process, if I just focus here in the middle, cause, outcome, where actor A doing something then leads actor B to do something, you would the positivist kind of process tracing would be doing these observables of, okay, well, actor A did this, but then the more interpretivist would be asking things like, what were the intentions or perceptions of action? What were the actors' understanding of the actual game, being played? And so the social or interpretivist process tracer would spend a lot of time trying to understand, perhaps through actual like ethnographic or interpretive interviewing, understand how do things typically work in this kind of setting? What are the social roles? What is expected? What is then different? Well, how can we interpret what actions mean? And this, so for example, if the things that I study, high level EU decision making, um, I would, you know, I was able to, by spending a lot of time in Brussels talking to a lot of people, I was able to for example, figure out what actually meant something. And what didn't. And sometimes it was small little clues that I would have never have understood until I understood, for example, how lawyers think. And then when they write shall instead of will, or for example, that actually was a huge big deal. And that was one of the most key pieces of evidence. But the only way I understood that was spending a lot of time talking to people. So the interpretivist process tracing would be kind of interested in processes, things moving, people interacting with each other, but then digging a bit deeper to try and understand both kind of the social roles, the games that are being played, and then the meanings that actors ascribe to the moves that they're making in the game. Real briefly, and then we'll have some time for questions. Was process tracing basically is interested in, you could say, positive cases where we have an outcome and we have cause and known context present. There's no reason to trace a process in a case where your cause and outcome are not present. That's kind of like if we're going back to Hilde's example with the tree. This is you don't have water and you don't have a tree, and then you're just kind of, okay, great. There's no process to actually investigate, and process tracing is really interested in those, let's say, positive cases where you have X and Y, and then at least in theory there might be a process. Of course, a lot of process tracing is going to find out that either there's no linkage between X and Y, or it worked in a very different way than you thought it. But at least there should be those X and Ys, and that would be the types of cases that we're looking at. Once you understand, I would say, the typical or positive cases, then things like deviant cases where some process breaks down, it should have worked, but it didn't. Those can then be really interesting. One of the challenge, of course, is just because you know that it works in one case, that doesn't, and this is one of the disadvantages of process tracing. I'll let Hilde come in maybe with a comment on this. And challenges is that just because I've investigated in one case, I cannot assume it's going to work like that in other cases. Is it going to? I know it works here. This is a COVID case, for example, some kind of crisis process outcome, but is it going to work in another case of crisis, for example? You don't really know until you at least have investigated other cases. Did you have anything you want to add on generalization or?
No, not really. So I think an interesting thing that you just said about negative and deviant cases. I think one of the things that with Patrick that we're probably going to make the biggest fuss about is ultimately that process tracing is always about typical cases. From the perspective of process tracing, if process tracing is a within case method, then all cases are typical cases. They're just typical cases of different things. And so the whole labels of
Hmm.
deviance and negative, they only exist, or irrelevant cases even, they only exist from the cross-case perspective. But from the perspective of process tracing, they're all typical cases. So if you'd be interested in knowing how trees die because of a lack of water, then you should study a tree that you don't give water and see what happens inside that tree, probably quite literally how things are starting to dry out and how it kind of crumbles and whatever it is that a tree does that is dying because of lack of water. So I'd say that's a typical case. It's just a typical case of something else. So that's one thing that we're really working on. What I think is interesting, because in relation to generalization, there's a difference between generalization and extrapolation. And sometimes if you read the literature on what can be generalized, so this is Nancy Cartwright. She writes a lot about, if it works here, but why does it work there? Or if it works here, how can we claim it also works there? How can we imagine it also works there? But then we're talking about extrapolation, whereas generalization tends to stay within those bounds within which we know the theory should work. And if there you find a case that doesn't work, that's interesting, right? Because then you're going to explore, okay, so what was different in this case? Which of the conditions wasn't there? Or what extra condition was there that blocked or hindered the process? Whereas in case of extrapolation, you're asking the question, does my theory also work in a different context? And that's a different question. That's my little intervention
Yeah.
here.
Hilde, there are some questions. There's one for you first.
Yeah, I saw it. So this is it's actually it gets us right at where we are, I think. So the productivity. Let's see. How can researchers differentiate between causal productivity scope conditions that define the general applicability of a mechanism and the contextual factors in process tracing that may alter or obscure the mechanism's operation? So I would like to make a distinction between scope conditions in the way they're treated in this more positivist understanding of mechanisms and processes. For me, scope conditions always have to be causally productive. If a scope condition doesn't do anything, it's irrelevant. You can essentially throw it out. So what I would also like to see generally is if there's a particular scope condition, how does it come in to the steps of the mechanism? How does it shape the entities and the activities that they're engaging in? If there's an answer, actually it doesn't, well, then it's not a scope condition, because then apparently it was irrelevant for the functioning of the mechanism and for the coming about of the outcome. Now, I would use the term contextual factor specifically if you're not aiming to generalize from that case. So for me, I would say contextual factors and scope conditions are actually different. That contextual factors just say, okay, well, contextual factors should still be relevant, because otherwise, they don't have to be described. But the context within kind of, especially if you're more interpretivist, you're doing highly idiosyncratic case studies, saying, well, it's the context that made the case. It's also the context then that makes it idiosyncratic, that makes it unique and specific in the way it produced the outcome. Whereas scope conditions for me are very much linked to generalizations, even if they're very bounded generalizations. I'd say there's the difference. So I would make the difference between scope conditions and contextual factors in that way. So I make a theoretical cut, but I don't know, Derek, how you see that. If you see that so strictly.
No, I actually was looking at the other questions. Sorry, I wasn't.
Ah,
Is that we have a couple other questions. Maybe we should just quickly go through those.
sure. Yeah.
Yeah. There's one. So I can actually see in the just chat. I'll just briefly. Can you do process tracing when you don't have a theory in advance? Yes, 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 yes. Actually, I think you probably never really. We often will have an idea of some kind of relationship, but I don't think I've ever actually had the final process theory. I never started with it. It's always a much more abductive kind of learning process. And this is also perhaps why there's another question about explaining outcome and theory testing building. Actually, I'm not loving those distinctions that I put forward at one point because I think theory testing and theory building kind of meld into each other. And my experience and the experience of anybody I know that has used process tracing has been that it's a much more back and forth. You have hunches, you develop what you call a sketch of a process, and then you engage with empirical research. You find out you're wrong, and you revise your theory, and then end up with an evidence process theory. And this is not just curve fitting. This is not cherry picking, because this is no different in that respect than what you would do in a criminal investigation, where you typically don't have the final theory of the crime when you go out and start collecting empirical material in the field. There's another question about QCA and case selection. Just real briefly, I don't think you need to use QCA would be the first answer. You can just do a more kind of a quick and dirty comparison. So you might select, let's say, democratization processes in Latin America. You categorize, you have Brazil, you have Argentina, you have Chile. You then think about, based on reading the literature, what are the differences? What are the similarities between those cases? One of the things you really need to remember if you're using QCA and process tracing, though, and I think what everybody forgets, is that Charles Reagan, when he talked about QCA, he talked about as an iterative method that you'd get to know your cases. For example, you would actually do case studies. And then you would often find out that what you thought was causal in your QCA or what was relevant actually turns out not to be relevant. There could be many different things with your QCA that should be changed. And then you revise your QCA. You then have another set of cases, and it should be a back and forth also between initial QCA, a selection of one or more cases for process tracing, but then the process tracing should inform your QCA and a refinement of your QCA. So I think but you don't have to use QCA. You can also just use some kind of just a table or a method of agreement kind of comparison.
Maybe if I can jump in
Yeah.
here for a second, especially on the QCA question, because we're literally writing a book on how to combine process tracing with QCA. So obviously my answer is going to be yes, this is possible. It has to be possible. It should be possible. However, we do think that it's not as obvious as it's sometimes assumed, to the extent that QCA is a cross-case method. It draws a causal inference by the observation of constant conjunctions and covariations. That's your truth table outcome in a QCA. Process tracing is a within case method. It wants to study what happens in that case. Now, they're adjacent. They're both case-based. We are definitely making the argument that they're complementary, but they're only complementary if you make sure that the ontological and epistemological assumptions that go into your process tracing align with the basic logic of QCA. And so not every understanding of process tracing can be easily understood within a QCA design. So that means that your process tracing is to a certain extent forced, if you wish, a little bit more into this regularity understanding over scope conditions and generalizations, to the extent that a QCA would have you let's say you have 5 or 6 cases that are found to have a similar pathway, that have a similar set of conditions, a causal configuration that leads to a particular outcome, and you want to select one of those cases to do a process tracing in. But that does somewhat imply or assume that those other 6 cases are explained by a sufficiently similar mechanism. So you need to think through what that would mean and how you can translate back and forth between the process tracing and the QCA such that they're actually complementary. But that's also definitely a thing that we discussed during these 2 weeks in Vienna. And there's a forthcoming book, hopefully at some point soon, somewhere near you.
Okay, I can see that the time is gone. I can see there was one question about process tracing ideas. I would say any additional questions, you're more than welcome to send to me or to Hilde um, um, by email. I'll provide a short answer. So you're welcome to do that. And otherwise, yeah, we hope to see many of you in Vienna, either for the more introductory and or for the second week. I mean, it would be possible to do both weeks, but you should at least have some form of research that for week two that you are, that you have some ideas about the theory, you have some ideas about the empirics that would actually make sense to get feedback on. Yeah.
That's
So I think.